So we have Miki here. Miki loves homeschooling her kids and playing volleyball and doing roller derby. She will break your leg. And that's 100% true because she's done it before. You better watch out. Heard a little bit of, huh? I'm not lying. That's a true story. I heard that one last night at the speaker dinner. That was fun. That's what we wanted. Y'all remember James? James Gray? They also do all-night coding adventures together. That's fine. That's good.
I move fast and break shit.
It still works. Would you like a mic now? Yeah. Everybody give a round of applause for Miki.
I feel like I need time to get ready all the way. I need to get to my keynote thing. Hold on. I know you want to watch me up here and just talk. So enjoy yourself. I'm almost ready. All right. Okay. So my talk is titled APIs All the Way Down. And my history is I got married very young. I got married at 19. My husband and I had 4 kids by the time I was 25, and then I had my 5th before I turned 30. At 34, I returned to school, graduated at 36, and then became a software. 36? No, I returned at 36 and became a software engineer at 38, and started skating at 39, which is the most important part there. But so this was my birthday. My kids wanted to know what I wanted to do, so I wanted to go out and go skating. These are my kids and John's girlfriend, Daniela. And we had a great time that night, good times all around. My daughter, Kate, will be ready for an internship. She's a junior at NC State now, and she needs an internship this coming summer. So if you're interested in someone that's the mini Miki, here she is. All right, so yes, and as I thought that Amos's talk was great because I do a lot, when I pick my topic, APIs all the way down, I picked this topic, I think when I was at Gig City and they invited me back, I started thinking about what I wanted to talk about. And then when they look for confirmation, I'm like, I don't know what I'm talking about. And then it came to me, and then I spent like 6 months thinking about it, and yesterday writing the slides. So it's going to be great fun. And I have to tell a joke? Apparently that's one of Amos's rules. Okay, so if I told you this last night, you're cheating if you answer. What does a pepper do when it gets angry? It gets jalapeno face. All right. So when I gave a description of this talk, I made some bold claims. I like bold. I don't know if you'd noticed the way I get real close to the mic sometimes. Like the boldness, I like that. So you're behind on defining and maintaining your APIs, and it's costing you big money. And it's draining your life away. And if it's not draining yours away, it's draining mine away. Okay? So, and you don't even know it. And that I'm going to stand behind that first quote. But this next one's a little, towards the end, it gets a little dicey and make some bold claims. I'm going to show you the APIs you're neglecting, the APIs you never defined, the problems you're having because of it, and I'm going to start the conversation on how you fix it. It's a conversation. It's not a conversation that you have with me. I'm not telling you not to talk to me, but no, I'm just joking. No, but it's a conversation that happens at your workplace. It's a conversation that needs to happen with your team. It's a conversation that needs to happen with the people in your life that you're interacting with. So API stands for Application Programming Interface. And when you look that definition up, it's an interface or communication protocol between a client and a server intended to simplify the building of client-side software. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting to me that first of all, they restrict it to a server and a client. Because in my mind, when I think about things interacting, I start thinking about how all the things interact, how data interacts with my code, how clients interact with the server, fine. But I think I like the term, I like to use it way more broadly because I tend to think of it as just an interface, but I use the word API. So if you're going to, well, actually me, you can save it. I know it's just an interface. So why, the question you have is why? Why does it simplify the building of client-side software? Well, I'm going to say that 1, an API tells you how to request data. 2, it tells you how to interpret error codes, and it lets you know when there is an error. 3, it tells you the expectation of every request. This is great. We can go in, we know what data we can get, we know how to get it, we know when we mess up, and when it works, we have our data. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing. So APIs, basically, they manage expectations. They allow you to quantify what you need, what you have, what you need, and how to get it. And most importantly, they tell you when there's an error or an exception. Now, that all sounds amazing. Is there documentation? Like, what happens when you don't have any docs? How in the world do you interact with an API that you don't know how it works? What happens when the documentation isn't correct? Well, in these situations, people generally speaking, what they're going to do is they're going to imagine. They're going to ask themselves, what would I do if I wrote this API? How would I structure it? What would I expect to be in this request? What would I name that parameter? That's what we ask ourselves. And in psychology, we call this projecting. You see someone ravenously eating a bunch of food, you're like, man, if I was eating like that, I would be hungry. You must be hungry. We project what we would do on them based on our own experience. And that's how we deal with APIs when we don't know what to do with it. Okay, now I'm shifting gears. I'm going to do this a lot. I tend to jump around. It helps you engage those parts of your brain that Amos was talking about, see? I'm here for you. Okay, so last year here I talked about questions and the questions we ask ourselves and how important it is to have a bank of questions. Because basically when you solve problems, you are asking yourself questions to get to the bottom of the problem. You're asking, like, it's like a 20 question game. What's broken? And you start, like, well, is it in the front end or the back end? Okay, it's in the front end. Is it on this component or that component? Okay, it's in this component. You're asking yourself questions. Is the machine plugged in? Is it turned on? You're asking all these questions, and the better you are at asking questions, the better you are at problem solving. So the bowling problem was interesting because this took it away from asking questions just in general, but what kind of questions do we want to ask to data? So I have all my slides for bowling in here. I am going to go through some of them quickly because it's not pertinent. But there are important concepts about bowling and how bowling works, and you usually play tin pin, and how frames work. But basically the idea is that a bowling game is 10 frames. But if I look at this data, which is all the rolls in a bowling game, that's not helpful to me because that's just a bunch of numbers in an array. It doesn't tell me, like if I looked at that outside of this, I wouldn't know that it's a bowling score. I wouldn't know anything about this. Now this bowling score happens to equal 0 because every one of them was a gutter ball. This is me when I bowl. And this is 12 strikes, and so that, of course, is a perfect game of 300 in case you're not a big bowler. And it is a game. There's no other special name for bowling besides game, as we talked about earlier. There you go. This is a mixed-up game because, like, you look at this, you're like, well, what is that? I don't even know. So, and that score is 100. And how do you get to that score? And how do those type of how does seeing the bowling rolls like this, is that helpful? I say no. I say that more helpful, and a step in the right direction, would be break up the bowling balls so that now you have frames. Because is the game showing now? It's showing you domain knowledge about the data. The data has been restructured. The data is the same, but now it's giving you domain knowledge simply by its format. But this really isn't enough, because in bowling, I want to ask for more information so I can score frames. And so what that looks like, I propose that really if you're wanting to structure this data, because of how you have to count sometimes bonus balls or add things in, now I can look at a frame and work with it. I can ask the frame the questions that I need to ask and get the data I want back. I have made, if you will, a micro API to this data, and it's super helpful in interacting with it in the future because I've trained the data what it needs to give me, and when I know what I need to ask, I know how to get the data, and I'll know when there's an error. I mean, it's not going to throw an error, but if you ask for wrong property, you know what I'm saying. Okay, so going through this. Woo-woo. Okay, so last year's talk was on questions, and after I got done giving the talk, I kept on thinking about questions. And I kept on thinking about questions, and I started questioning the problems I encounter. And I started to question the problems I see other people encounter. And I started to question the problems that come to me, that people come to me to help them solve. And what I began to see was that consistently, questions would circle around communication. When you try to get back the problems people are facing at work, that the tech stack is not the problem. The people are the problem, okay? So when you start thinking about that consistently, the problems people were facing had a lot to do with the communication they were hitting at work. Because And that could be within groups, that could be with a larger org, and their communication would always circle around, well, what's expected? Like, what am I expected to do? Or how do I get that data? How do I get what I need? Or how will I know when something's wrong? These are the questions people are asking, which happen to be the same questions you ask about APIs or the same benefits you get from APIs. And what I noticed is that once there was a communication issue, it would just trigger a snowball effect where all of a sudden other important dynamics like morale, happiness, conflict resolution, teamwork, trust, they all start to decline. Because communication, all the things that help us know what to expect, how to get it, and when there's an error, we don't have those things. So you become very insecure in an environment where things are unpredictable. And without an API, things get unpredictable pretty fast because lots of things. I'm getting off track. Okay. So if you've been to the South, now this is just a shameless copy paste, right? So you move down to the South and you meet some sweet people and they're like, oh, welcome to the neighborhood. You start talking like, oh, bless your heart. You're like, oh, they're so nice. No, they're not. They're not being nice. Now, sometimes people are genuinely nice, but now I can't, if someone tells me, bless your heart, I'm like, oh, thanks. But basically, people tend to follow right along when I talk about computers having APIs, when I talk about server clients, when I talk about data. But once you move over into this people side of thing, they're like, wait a minute, that's people? People's not code. But my position is that people have APIs. Teams have APIs, organizations have APIs, geographical places have APIs, families have APIs. You ever gone to Thanksgiving with someone's family and you're the only non-family member there? And you're like, what is going on? You're like, that would be an uncaught exception at my house. I don't know what's happening over there, So, and the problem is that when you don't think about APIs as if they are with people, because we don't think of it that way, the problems go unaddressed for way too long. Oftentimes, they're never actually solved, and it costs you a ton of money. I mean, just think about when you're developing against the API without documentation. How much longer does it take you? And how confident are you that the API is not going to change, that it's versioned properly? You're just not. So when you think about this with people, when someone doesn't know how to interact, that changes their interactions with other people and their teammates forever. And so the biggest problem with software is people, and the best thing about software is people. And if we don't improve the people API side of things, we're just accepting that an integral part of our work product is broken, and we're just going to take the hit. So if that's the approach people are taking, that it's broken and we're just going to try and work around it or act like it doesn't exist, I don't think we're quantifying how much it's really costing us in terms of productivity and innovation. So before we can fix people's APIs, we have to attempt to understand them. Like, what are people's APIs? This is a harder thing to get at, like to define exactly how would you document yourself in an API. But a helpful exercise is to ask yourself questions, like if you're an individual contributor, how do you consume data? And are you visual? Are you tactile? Do you want a whiteboard? Do you want to talk it out? Do you want to type it in? Like what part of consuming data is helpful for you? And then, like, what about when you're serving data? Can you serve data out to other people who don't have that same preference of data? If they are a visual learner and you are verbal, like how do you bridge that gap? How do you make sure that you can actually serve the data in a meaningful way to other people? Can you, do you return 400s? And are your 400s helpful? Like, you ever make an API request, you get like, it's a 400. That's it. That's all you got. It's a 400. And then sometimes you get a 400 back or something like that. It's like, oh, you're missing this name field, or this is a required field. You're like, oh, that's helpful. I can do something with that. But a 400 with no data is like, oh, okay. Have you ever thrown an uncaught exception? And you're like, what would that be? I'm not sure, but I think you would know if you did it. Do you need a global error handler? This is kind of like a personal preference. I kind of do. I kind of need to walk away sometimes before I make a global error. But like, if you thought about how you interact with the world, what happens when things go wrong for you? That type of thing. And what happens when you get an error back? Like, how do you handle that? Do you do another request the same way? How do you change up your request? How does that go? Because individual contributor APIs are the basis for all other APIs in a company. And so when a company can try to structure, they can try and tell you, you need to make your API like this, or you need to make your API like that. That doesn't work unless the individual contributors actually embrace it and actually do that thing. And the problem with a lot of companies is, especially when they're starting out and they're new, there's a lot of tribal knowledge. And tribal knowledge creates an area of uncertainty for new teammates because there's something that everyone else knows that they don't know, and they don't know how to get there. And that creates, I mean, you can imagine, you know when you walk into a room and everyone else seems to understand how it's working, and you're like, what the? I don't, and you're just trying to sit back, you're like, trying to feel it out. And then you go do something, you're like, crap, I did it wrong. You know, it's very intimidating. So that tribal knowledge, especially when you're not being upfront with the fact that, like, if you're in a situation where you're in high growth, you know, it's going to happen that you don't always have the time to hammer all these things out or make them well known. But you should be on an effort to make your APIs discoverable as you can until you have time to document them. Anyway, and the thing is that if you go to an environment where you don't know what's going on, but you have a similar background to everyone else already in the environment, usually you figure out faster what's going on, right? So if you, we'll flesh it out a little bit later, but and the reason for that is when you match the background of the people that you're joining, when your experience match, you project, I don't know how to do this, how would I do this? And then by and large, it matches. And so then you move forward. But if you don't have the same experience, your first guess or your first projection is not going to match. And that makes it very hard when you come in and everyone has the same experience and you do not. Your first guess is going to be wrong. And you need to get a better 400 back. Okay, I get it, I'm wrong. Give me some information. I need more information in order to align myself, in order to understand. So imagine that you had a group of 10, a team of 10, and of those 10, 9 of them had been in the military a considerable amount of time. And they hire a civilian. And then these guys, these ladies, start talking. And they are using military lingo, and they are referencing all kinds of stuff. And they're using phrases that don't just translate into the phrases they mean way different or more things than that. Well, this person over here is the only person experiencing the pain. These people do not see the pain because they're military and they understand what this lingo means. Now, this gap can be bridged many ways, but the only real effective way to do it is for these people to appreciate the fact that they need to communicate in a meaningful way to this person, and this person to make an attempt to try and communicate in that same way. They need to develop an API that everyone can agree on. Because the fact of the matter is, if you ask all these people where the communication breakdown is, they're all going to point at this person. But it's not, unless the actual information that is the breakdown in communication is integral to the work that you're doing, it's not their fault. If, let's say you go into a place where everyone skated, it would be the most amazing place ever, let me tell you. I tell you right now, it'd be the most amazing place. But if someone new were to come in, do I want to damage their chances of success by connecting their love of skating with their work product? I do not. So if I do not want to do that, I have to think about what APIs am I using? And by putting these people in a situation to have to understand something totally not related to their job in order to interact with the rest of the organization. And if you're doing that, we need to fix it. So, and the other thing to remember is that uncertainty in how to communicate with each other creates FUD, which is fear, uncertainty, or doubt. And you'll hear me use FUD a lot. So fear is, a FUD equals fear, uncertainty, or doubt. And what you end up with is this person, when they interact, they definitely have FUD. They do not understand what's supposed to happen. And these people, they can sense that something's off there, so they have FUD. And just everything goes downhill. So what we want to do is try and get rid of the FUD. Because the crappy thing about this whole thing is when you walk into situations where one person is completely out, or a smaller group is outside of the communication, this can happen without any malice or any intention whatsoever. It's the important thing to remember. This happens all by itself when you put people in a room. They're going to naturally group by their backgrounds and experience, and this just happens unless you're actively fighting against it. A short rabbit trail. You'll see the slide twice. When I started doing this talk, I wasn't anticipating this, actually. I was not anticipating to have so many correlations with diversity and inclusion. I did not expect that, and it was not intentional, so I dropped 2 slides in, I'm going to touch on it and move. But what I realized when I look at this slide here is that like, let's imagine all these people, 9 people, were celiacs. They're completely gluten intolerant. Well, now that's a big problem for this team, and they're going to solve that problem, right? But when this person is outside of communication, That's not such a big problem. It only affects one person. So now it's not the same team priority to address because it's affecting the minority. So the person most affected by the problem and the person most in need of help with the problem is the person that has least say in whether or not it's addressed. The majority has way better ability to influence that. Okay, so teams. Let's go with your API for teams. What do you do if a request comes in the wrong way? Flip a table. I don't know, but you know. So there's lots of things you can do in a team, but how do you do that? Or I read the wrong slide. Okay, how do you surface needs? How do you let people know what you need? How do you resolve conflict? What kind of errors does your team throw? What kind of tables does your team flip? How do you handle a 400? When someone asks you for something, you just tell them, nope, can't do that. Or do you give them any idea what direction to go, where to get the rest of the information? How do you handle 503s? Talk to your manager, tell them to talk to your manager. I'm not telling you how to handle these things. I'm just saying you should know how you're supposed to handle these things. And then there's intra-org, like between teams. You know, how do you manage dependencies when you have another team or another product that you have to use? And what commitments do you have to other teams? So what I started to realize is that when people don't understand the expectations that are placed upon them, when they don't know what they're supposed to be doing, or they don't understand their responsibilities, what you end up is, you always have cognitive load in any problem you're solving. And so when you're solving a problem where you feel like you understand the path to get to the end, the cognitive load is high. You don't have to think about a lot of things. You're going to subtract 7, divide by -4. Boom, I'm done. But when you don't have clear expectations, or maybe you've gotten inconsistent results, or maybe things are just crazy, your cognitive load goes from that simple thing, when you understand the API, to something very complex. All of a sudden you have to think about all types of things. This comes into play especially when organizations seem to have different outputs for the exact same input. Someone tries something, does something, and it works. You try that same thing, and it doesn't work. So then you have to catalog, okay, mine didn't work, theirs worked, what's the difference? And then you see someone else do it. Like, okay, theirs worked, what's the difference? So now instead of just understanding the rules of algebra and solving that simple equation, you've got to keep all of history in your head to try and figure out what the API is to get that thing done. So sometimes that not understanding how an organization works or not understanding how to communicate within the org will try to address. Now they can go with larger teams, with more people involved, hoping that more eyes on the problem will solve the issue. That comes at a higher communication cost, but you do get the benefit of lower silo risk, so that's great. Sometimes they'll go with smaller teams, which require less coordination, less collaboration, lower communication needs, because it's only a couple people working together, and high silo risk. So, excuse me. So, but regardless of which one you choose, you're not getting away from the communication needs. The communication needs just change. On a small team, you need to make sure that the whole team, the small few people that are working together, clearly have the vision of what's going on, because there are going to be fewer people to check them if they start getting bogged down or they go down the wrong road. On a larger team, there's more communication required within the team and that type of thing, but there's less communication required necessarily because you have more accountability. So from the outside, you might not need as much input because you have more people on the team that can help keep you on the right path, but the smaller the team, you're going to have, basically the whole thing is, no matter which way you go, communication is still an issue. Communication is still a need that has to be addressed. So then you're wondering, okay, what are the warning signs that my company has an API problem and that maybe maybe it needs help? Well, is there FUD? What are the signs of FUD? Or what kind of things can produce FUD? No, what was my question? I should know what I'm talking about. Warning signs that people's APIs need help. You have FUD. That in itself is an indicator that you have some API issues. Another indicator you have API issues is when identical inputs produce different results. And because the people that are getting different results are like, why is the result different? Is that person like, maybe they're just better connected. Maybe they have more influence. Maybe Jupiter aligned with Mars. You can't figure it out. And that's an indicator that the API is broken in your company. Is psychological safety low? Regardless of whatever words a company uses to try and tell you, feel free to speak your mind. If their actions say otherwise, they're going to believe what they actually see. And unpredictable org behavior means that an unknown outcome is possible, and none of us would like to gamble with our careers or a lot of things that we work on that we love, we don't want to gamble with those things. So if psychological safety is low, it indicates that people don't understand how to interact with the org. Parallel development, does it result in incompatible code pieces? Do you have two teams working on stuff, they get it all done, they go to hook it up, like, that's not what you were supposed to build? Really? That would indicate communication broke down well earlier, or at some point they diverged and they did not contain the same type of principles to hold them together when they were isolated. They didn't, their network partition tolerance was really low. And I just helped write. I was on a very, very small team. My teammate Trevor and I, there were a few people involved closely with the team, and of course all kinds of other dependencies as far as other teams working on stuff. But we just wrote the performance product. And when we were writing this, we were writing verticals through our code. So we would try and get something all the way through back end, front end. And what we would do is we'd get together before we started working, and I'm like, okay, let's meet here. And then I would write in the type of data I was expecting to get. I would hard code it. And then I would go work to build up to it. And then he would work to build up to it. And in the end, you just pop out the hard coded data, and bam, we're there. This worked great. It was like seamless. We were blazing a fast trail because our communication was good and we understood the expectations. We understood when we got an error. We understood all these things. But if you're getting incompatible code pieces, that's an indicator that maybe your communication's off. Also, whenever you go to an org and you're like, hey, how do I do this, or how do I do that, or how do I do this, and it's always ask, and it's always the same person back here. Like, ask Joe, ask your manager, ask. That means that's an indicator that there's a bottleneck somewhere, or that people don't have enough of the vision of what's supposed to happen to make their own decisions, so they've got to go to someone else. It could be a silo issue due to company growth. But oftentimes, especially on a mature company, when you have to go ask for all kinds of stuff, it indicates that people don't really understand what's expected. They don't understand what they're supposed to do. They don't have a clear vision of where they're going. So they have to go to someone who they see as a better vision holder. And you need to get that vision pushed down so that everyone knows what that vision is. Another one is when feedback seems to be ignored. If you're a manager, or maybe you're working with someone, you're trying to give them feedback on how to get better, and they seem to be receptive, and they go off and they don't listen, well, maybe you just, they kind of understand what you're getting, but the communication's not there, so they don't have really anything to act on. Because if someone came up and spoke to me in French, I would hope it wouldn't be held against me for not understanding. I'm going to try my hardest to understand, but if it's not communication that I can get, I had French earlier. I don't know, it just happened to time last. Amos and I, this is a very good scheduling to have my talk right after Amos's, by the way. Yeah, but so like when you're giving feedback to people and they seem receptive to taking it, but they don't implement it, most likely they're not actually catching what you're laying down. Indicators of bad API, and this is where we get into danger zone. Indicators of a bad API are also indicators of power games. And as you get in growing companies, it's very important to watch out for these. So there's this book, The 48 Laws of Power. I've listened to it many times. It's somewhat dark, but it's made me able to identify power games much faster now, which is super helpful. And what you have to remember about power games is that power games they're all based in draining power from someone and putting it someplace else. So regardless if these are intentional power games or they're accidental power games, they're draining somebody's power and putting it someplace else. So when interactions carry FUD, people will always look for ways to reduce. This is kind of out of order. I'm going to skip this one. Okay, so this is one of the laws of power. It's always say less than necessary. Now, in a best situation, you didn't get a full answer when you ask a question. In the worst situation, they're always saying less than necessary because it's a power game. Make other people come to you. Use bait if necessary. Are you always have to ask the same person for something? Are they not getting out of that position? Well, the org either needs to address that. That could just be a oversight, or they may actually be implementing Law 8. I know this sounds kind of dark to think that people do this, but they do. I mean, it's dark and we don't want to admit it, but like we all know someone that did this. Law 11, learn to keep people dependent on you. And you can do that by making sure they don't understand what's going on and they always have to come to you for help. Failing APIs also make you susceptible to other power games, to other laws of power. Keep others in suspended terror. Cultivate an air of unpredictability. All right? So this is when same inputs produce different results. You are cultivating an air of unpredictability. People are going to duck and cover. Don't do that. Law 20, we've seen this played between couples forever do not commit to anyone, right? But this happens at work too. Like, I need to know, do I need to do that? Well, no, it's a yes or no. It's not, it's like, notice my slides are very much like me, black and white. It's a binary decision. Do I need to do this, yes or no? And if they won't commit to what they're expecting, or you can't get commitments, then that's an indicator of either bad leadership or just a power game. Law 31, control the options, get others to play with the cards you deal. This is very easy to do when you're the only one with the information. If you do not want power games play within your org, you're going to try and get your APIs hammered out. You're going to try and get this communication fixed because someone, we always do things with the best possible intention, but if you grow and all of a sudden there's money, people are going to come in and start doing this stuff to make their places secure. You've got it, and it's bad for everyone. And Law 48, assume formlessness. And if you don't give people something to grab onto, if you don't say what you're expecting to do, if you won't commit to anything, and if they don't understand enough to actually hold you to it, you are formless. And trying to reform that is like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. Good luck with that. Another thing, learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is a condition in which a person suffers from a sense of powerlessness arising from a traumatic event or persistent failure to succeed. So, if someone is trying to fix these things and they keep on trying and they're trying and they're trying and they continue to fail, at some point they will give up. They will give up and not try. And one of the interesting things about learned helplessness was that these were like, I read one on parenting, like with kids, and they were observing some learned helplessness in children. And they weren't, they were trying to get some patterns. But I think the most important thing here is this unpredictability part one. Unpredictability, people do not like that. You see that with APIs. You don't like it when they behave differently. You don't like it when you talk to someone and you're like, that person, you're like, I might go up and say hi, and they might like be angry with me. I might go up and say hi, and they're gonna be really friendly. That's like, that's a big risk to go up and talk to them, Unpredictability, no one likes that, and it causes all of these things and contributes to learned helplessness. And so that's kind of a side note. CAP theorem, who knows it? What are the three things? Yell it out, yeah. There you go, good. So a CAP theorem is consistency, as a C, and that means are all your data nodes, all the data, is it matching across all of them? I think the technical definition is when you make a request, you either get the most current right or you get an error. You will never get an old piece of data. Availability would be that whenever you ask, it will give you the data. It may not be the data that's the most recent data. It may not have been a chance to be updated yet, but it's going to give you something. And partition tolerance is how well does your system react when messages are lost, when there's high latency, people aren't getting them. Do the nodes still answer? What do they do? And so if we start thinking about each person as a distributed node, I think this helps us get closer to what we need to fix the API gap. Because you can only optimize, you can't optimize for all three of CAP. You can only optimize for, let's say, two. I don't even know about two, because two of them match pretty, anyway. But the idea is, you want to kind of focus on what's most important to you and optimize for that situation. So I would posit that when someone joins a team, if you can spend the time making them consistent, if you can spend the time making sure they understand the API, making sure they understand what's expected, making sure they understand how they know when something's wrong, making sure they understand all the things that you can possibly explain to them, or just how to interact and who to talk to. Then after that, after they are consistent, you don't have to spend as much time and energy on C. Because think about it, once someone understands how things work, now they're available, and they can actually start handling requests. And now they can actually tolerate network partition. If for some reason they're isolated from their team, or they're working remotely, or they're like out of contact with someone, it's okay. You're all following the same rules. You're all following the same API. What you generate will be much more consistent. So this is like probably the biggest thing that I can offer as far as solving your problems, is trying to spend some of your resource time in making sure people are consistent. They know what's expected, they know what an error is, and they understand how the API of the org works. You do have to be aware of trade-offs. I mean, sometimes there is a cost to consistency. Everything that you want in the world, it's a trade-off, right? You go for consistency. Well, while you're making that person consistent, they may not be available, and they may not be able to tolerate network partition. But if you can hold that time of getting consistency, if you can focus on it and address that, then all of a sudden the availability and the network partition handling, that will come with time. But there is a trade-off. So I understand there's a trade-off, but I think it's worth it because I think it helps everybody. So a clear vision and leadership can prevent many of the issues that happen with communication, because when you understand what's expected of you, you know how to deliver it. I dare say none of us would tell our developers, hey, move fast and break things. That's the only rule. If that was the only criteria, things would go down here really fast, right? So this isn't the only criteria that's used, but it seems that way because that's what they keep saying, right? But clearly, there are other guidelines that they're using to implement this. Move fast and break things so you can make I don't know what other things they would have as like guidelines, but there clearly are some, or else Facebook would be broken all the time. It's broken sometimes, but if you don't want this to be the only guiding principle, you need to flesh this out a little bit. You need to put a little bit more meat on this skeleton to make sure people understand what does this really mean. Because if in your background this meant something to you or carries higher value, when you tell someone that doesn't have that same background, they're not going to understand the implications. So those implications that are already in your head that you already know, make sure you flesh those out for people that don't have the same experience. And I would call those guiding principles. Now, the first knee-jerk reaction that I will absolutely get is, you want us to define every process and have like heavy micromanagement. No, I do not. I don't want a lot of red tape. I don't want everything defined. I want to be somewhere between falling off, like I'm driving on the road, I can fall off one way, which is only having these high-level principles that don't actually tell me what I need to do. And I can drive off the other way, which is try and tell everyone exactly how to do everything. That's not good either. What I would prefer is having guiding principles about how we interact with other people to figure out you can have conceptually the same goals, and the implementation will differ. So conceptually, if we are all on the same page with the goals, even if our implementation differs, we are still consistent with the org. So I think the defining guiding principles and making sure people understand what's expected of them, what an error is, what the data looks like, all of these things are integral to fixing the workplace. And the other thing is that everyone is responsible. Communication and vision issues, these should be in every teammate's head. Every teammate should have like that data store in their head, knowing what the company's wanting them to do, knowing how they're supposed to act. There shouldn't be a question, well, do they want me to do this, or do they, what do they care more about? Do they care more about me doing the right thing, or do they care more about me being nice? Because sometimes being nice isn't doing the right thing, right? So you have to ask yourself, everyone needs to be able to answer those questions. They need to be able to have some kind of rubric in their head about what the company really values in order to make the right decisions. So I can put this in terms all of us know, or hope. I'm assuming that we've all coded a web app. If you haven't, you're not lesser person. We just don't share the same experience. But when you're making a route, you're going to make a route to create something. So you make this route, and you should be thinking that Bobby drop tables might show up. That's what you should be thinking, right? And so you should be guarding against that security flaw. You should be thinking, I have to do this work, and a necessary part of that work is making sure that I protect against injection attack, plain and simple. And to me, this is identical to the communication burden. Security is every developer's concern. Communication is every developer's concern. Just because if a developer worked on something or came across something in somebody else's code where there's a security hole, they wouldn't say, well, not my code, I'm good. No, they'd be like, this is a security concern, this is everyone's responsibility, let's jump in here and fix it. When we see communication gaps, it doesn't matter if we made the gap. We may be able to jump in and fix it. It's everyone's job to try and make sure that the leadership and the vision and the communication of the org is all functioning. Because just like security concerns are every developer's concern, so are communication. But oftentimes it gets dropped off, it's a soft skill, whatever. All right. So APIs of your organization will indeed flow over into interviewing. And how this works is when you can't tell people what you want or what you value or what you need already in an organization, we're not even talking about candidates. If it's unclear what the company really wants in someone, how they really want them to behave, if the interaction's unclear, that's when you have a bad API. But if you can't quantify culture fit into a rubric, you won't be able to establish consistency. And maybe a better way to say this is, if you can't quantify your culture fit into a rubric, you are vulnerable to implicit bias. And this is just how it works. Because if you think back to the slide with 9 pink people on it and 1 not pink person on it, the way the pink people, when they talk to each other, they're going to click. And that click also happens to mean that they're good communicators. Well, why is that? Like we know why that is, because they speak the same language, they have the same background, they have the same experience. And if you can't quantify what's valuable to you as in a culture fit rubric, you are just basically giving a blank check for people to allow implicit bias without question. Now, we can all do the implicit bias training and learn about what it is, but training does not actually mean it gets implemented. So if you cannot say what you really care about and put it in a rubric that can be graded with consistency, you are going to introduce implicit bias. Rabbit trail. There are two reactions when you point out the fact that there are API gaps in an organization. One of them is empathy. It's my favorite reaction when they empathize, because that means they're open to trying to fix it or at least have the discussion. And having the discussion alone means that you are more than likely going to understand better what the org wants, you know. But the other reaction is defensiveness. And so all the minorities in the room, if you start bringing these problems up and they're defensive, it's a huge warning. Huge warning. Bad things can happen to your career. You may want to let up. Majority, you see this, you have no excuse. You are much more protected. If you see that there's a communication breakdown, you are in a much better position to push on it. The nine pink ladies versus the 9 pink ones can make a much bigger change in this area. The one that's not clicking, the one that is having trouble communicating because all of a sudden there's lingo that they don't understand, that one, when they bring it up, they are seen as a problem and they are going to be exited. So just know, like, they are at risk. You are at risk if they get defensive. If they get defensive about the problem that you can't figure out how to interact with the org, you're at risk. But that doesn't give, if you feel like protected, if you're in the majority, you have to help. If you do not help, then it just reinforces the API is broken and we're going to leave it broken. Because bugs don't fix themselves. And this is likely the biggest problem that I have with how this is often treated. People think that if you can clearly see there's a problem, that it will go away. It will resolve itself. But that has a lot of hope in humanity, and maybe after 7 years in software, I just have a whole lot less hope in humanity. I don't know, but bugs do not fix themselves. People have to fix the bugs. Okay, so if you're in a position to help fix the bugs, you should do that, because it will make a big change, not just in your environment and not just the people you're interacting. This stuff does work its way out over time. It's like the best pyramid scheme ever. You're at a place where they really do a good job with this. That place ends up, you move on, you go other places, bam, you go someplace else, and now you can help again. And you can continue to help over and over. And apparently, I said, oh, I'm like going to end right on time. This is amazing. I'm like, I'm doing the math in my head. I'm like, I started at 12:25, right? That means I should end at 5 after. It's 5 after. Now go fix those APIs.